really experienced in life. Travelers travel and tell about it. So you build memories, and then it's sort of like climbing uphill, and then all of a sudden you turn around and you look and see what you've done and what your life was filled with. And it's sort of amazing to really be able to do that. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that have built a life of memories and then had trouble with their memory. And it's sort of sad, because that is what really your old age should be, is a time of being able to reflect and remember. So today I've had the chance of 3 months of building these memories, and I had to handwrite my notes this morning because my computer broke. And I have both a laptop and a desktop. Both of them are acting up, and none of them will print. So I was going to come with a black binder with all of my notes and everything in it. And the computers failed. And that made me think of where my life started. At a place where there were no computers, no printers. Telephones were sort of a new idea, and in fact, for many people my age, they remember before I do of a time when there weren't even dial phones. So that when you picked up the receiver, and when I went to Tabor in 1960, I was looking forward to going there because I had heard all about the switchboard operators down at the telephone office, that when you picked up your phone, they would answer, "Number, please." And you would give the number that you wanted, and they would arrange it. And so you had a personal interaction with someone every phone call you made. Can you imagine what life would be like if we had to do that? There were no calculators. When I went to school in chemistry, it was my major, we got a slide rule. That was the engineering, scientific way of computing and calculating, because adding machines, which were often little mechanical boxes, would basically only add and subtract. If you wanted to go into multiplication and division, you had to do it yourself. And so much of school, much of education, was teaching, adding and subtracting, and long division was a big third grade activity generally. And so we even learned in my school, which was a very advanced elementary school, how to calculate square roots. Now that's tricky, and I bet, how many of you know how to calculate on a piece of paper square roots? There's 1, 2, 3. That is a lost art. And so I started life in a society that had no cell phones, barely dial phones. We had no television whatsoever. And I was thinking this morning of all the things that we have now that we didn't have then. Fast food. We didn't have fast food. So if you wanted to get something and you didn't want to cook it yourself, which was generally done at home, you had to find a cafe or a diner where they had cooks and waitresses on hand, and they often closed at various hours. An all-night diner was a rare thing and very city-fied. So that if you lived out in the country, you were cooking for yourself. And that included things like bread, store-bought bread. That was a new thing when I was a kid. So anyway, that's what I look back on. Now, I want to talk about my life, but it intertwines with many of you because we call ourselves Mennonite, and I have spent my life tracing family trees, terraces. I'm helping a lot of the people there of whatever ethnicity to do theirs, because suddenly when you get old, you think it's important to know who your ancestors were. And so I have spent my life, and we'll talk about it, tracing genealogies. And I've got my own back on many lines, maternal and paternal, back into the 1600s. And hundreds of ancestors I've uncovered. And of all of them, every single one was a Mennonite. So that puts me into an interesting category that we could call ethnic Mennonite, because the Mennonites started, our particular variety started in Holland, got persecuted out of Holland and moved to Poland, of all places, where the king of Poland gave them assurance that they would have no religious persecution there. They were persecuted for other reasons because they wouldn't defend the cities, so they had to live outside the city walls. But they then moved as a group, fled from Holland, picking up stragglers along the way. We're in Poland for the longest period of time, probably from the 1530s until the 1790s, 1800. They were in Poland. Then Catherine the Great invites them to come to Russia, where they would get free land and freedom of religion and freedom from military service, and where they would have their own government and they could keep their own schools and their own language, all the wonderful things that Russia promised. And that lasted for almost 100 years, and then a czar comes along who says in 1870, you've got 10 years to get rid of all those privileges. You'll have to become Russian citizens, subject to Russian political leaders in your communities. You have to teach Russian in the schools. You're going to be expected to do military service. And he says that you've got 10 years. So between 1870 and 1880, people had to decide in Russia, Mennonites had to decide in Russia, where to go. They could stay and become Russian, which many of them did because they had lots of land. They were among the wealthy folks in Russia, South Russia, which is now Ukraine. But many decided to move, and so they sent out a team of delegates to look over the country in North America, and many then chose to come to North America starting about the end of 1873 and into 1873 and into the 80s of the 1800s, because America was opening up and had all this Midwestern land that they had confiscated from the Native Americans and indigenous people and gave to the railroads. And the railroads, in order to have enough business to put down rails and to do things, wanted farmers to farm the land. That filled a few grain cars on a train and established a market there. So they moved into the Midwest, and the rest is history. But from this Holland to Poland to Ukraine to Americas, over 400 years, they established their own ethnicity because no one wanted to marry in, and hardly anyone in wanted to marry out. So there was this inbreeding that took place among this group that they carried with them wherever they went, and here they ended up in the U.S., and they ended up with me as an example of someone whose ancestry is totally Mennonite. So that's what an ethnic Mennonite is someone that has that kind of a strange, interesting combination of genes that they carried with them from Holland to Poland to the Ukraine to here. Now, I looked at our church list, and we have about now, in this congregation, about 50% that are ethnic Mennonites. Well, what are the rest of you then? You're religious Mennonites because you've chosen to choose a church that has Mennonite leanings, Anabaptist policies and understandings and beliefs that you resonate with. So there's a difference between ethnic Mennonites and religious Mennonites. Now, I'm both, because I'm still a church member that's a Mennonite. My daughters are ethnic Mennonites, but they are not religious Mennonites. They go to other churches. A lot of people that maybe in our youth I called ex-Mennonites would marry out and they would join another church. And some then there were some congregations that attracted people. But when I was a child, everyone in Bakersfield, where I was born, in the Mennonite Brethren Church community there, and then moving to San Jose, where I really went to high school and college, and really consider the place where I grew up, the churches were almost totally ethnic Mennonite. So that gives you some idea of the cult that the rest of you have been choosing to join into. I mean, you've had to face this kind of a wall almost, because everybody in the church is in a way related. I think that of those that came from the Ukraine to here, I would bet that out of the thousands that are now in US, Canada, Paraguay, all over Australia, Europe, that we're all seventh cousins or less. And the history then is that we've got a Mennonite history that a lot of us claim as ours. So, for example, I have a great-great-grandfather, Abraham Peters, who was an elder in the church and had an independent congregation. And when all the rest were moving here, he had read Jung Stilling, a German theologian and author, who said that the second coming was going to occur in Central Asia. And so both of my father's parents were born in what's now Kazakhstan, in the same village. And it was called Turkestan then, and it was a total Mennonite settlement that went back as a whole congregation. It didn't work out too well, thankfully. So my grandparents moved here as children. Now, some of you are Canadian in your background, so your ancestors probably came over in the 70s or stayed in Russia, went through the revolution, lost their land, their privileges, their rights. Many lost their lives. And you have descended from people that came over to North America since the Russian Revolution, generally ending in about 1926, because that's when the Communist Party sort of closed the borders and said people couldn't go back there, couldn't leave the country anymore. In fact, I tried. As a fifth grade student, and we'll come to this, I better put my watch down here because I've got lots to say. I started my genealogical research when I was a fifth grader in San Jose. A very skilled fifth grade teacher, and I have had the most wonderful public school education that I think anybody that I talked to has had. Better than my daughters got here in Fresno. My public school teachers were dedicated people, and my parents, when they moved to San Jose, before they settled down there, they did the research and asked people, where are the best public schools? And they chose to move to the places where we had the best public schools. So I had a whole sequence. The best teacher in my life, elementary, high, college, university, was my high school Latin teacher. 4 years of Latin I got in that school, which shows you the kind of nature of that public high school, because it was willing to teach 4 years of Latin. And the teacher, of course, was so popular that a lot of the kids took Latin, but my parents did not understand why I didn't take Spanish. And so I've had to live that up, but my Latin has come very much in use throughout my life, so I'm very happy I did that. So I was born in Bakersfield on December the 13th, 1939. 39, I'm 86 right now, soon to be 87, have had a longer life than 3 of my grandparents ever had, a much longer life than my mother had. My father has still outlived me, so I've got a few years to go to catch up to him. But I've lived through a lot. I was born before the U.S. entered World War II. And I know, my memory has been good, luckily, and my earliest memories are of World War II. I was born in Bakersfield, but I really was born at my grandparents' house, because my mother, as soon as she felt the pains, went to her parents. because she knew her mother would take care of her, and she knew my father probably wouldn't. So she spent, for my older sister and me, both of us were born in a home. I have never spent a night in a hospital yet in my whole life. I've never had any illness that, and I'll talk at the end about how fortunate a life I've had, much better than many other people that I've lived with and talked to. So I was born in Bakersfield to the Bakersfield MB Church, fully ethnic Mennonite, wonderful upbringing, had some great times there. But it was World War II time. My earliest memory as a child is sitting under the kitchen table in Oildale, which was the suburb. It's still there. And we were in the landing pattern for what was then called Meadows Field. It was an Army Air Force base in Bakersfield. It, of course, now is their municipal airport, just as Fresno's airport that way was Hammerfield. And even in Shafter, right close to Bakersfield, there was Minterfield. The whole valley was everything that's now a major airport, and some have been dismantled since. There was one out in Firebaugh called Eagle Field. All of these were Army Air Force bases that were made to protect the western part of the United States because of a feared Japanese invasion. And my earliest memory is sitting under the table, kitchen table in our house with my mother and my sister, and a knock on the door, and the house was pitch black, window curtains closed, knock on the door. My father went to the door and talked. Later on, when I was much older, I remembered this. And my father said, "Oh yeah, I remember that too." He said that was the night that a submarine surfaced near Santa Barbara and shelled part of northern Santa Barbara, setting on fire some oil fields. Never knew that Santa Barbara had them, but they caught fire, and it was the suspected push of the Japanese suspected invasion of the country. That's my earliest memory. I went back to the encyclopedia to see when that happened, and it was at the end of February 1942. So I was just barely 2 years old, and I remember that. And that's the earliest memory I have. My memory generally is in which house we were living in when that particular event occurred. But I remember also being at Pismo Beach on September the 2nd, which is my father's birthday. We were celebrating his birthday by going to the coast. It's 1945, and all of a sudden the whistles blew and everybody went out in the streets in Pismo Beach cheering September 2nd, 1945, victory over Japan Day. That was the end of the war. And we celebrated in Pismo. We went to Pismo a lot. My mother, because she had at that point 3 kids beside herself, there were 5 in the family. We had another brother on the way. So she had a lot of ration book stamps. During the war, you couldn't just go to the store and buy coffee, which of course comes from overseas mostly. You couldn't get sugar because that was largely overseas. You certainly couldn't go to the service station and get gasoline. You had to have stamps that you got based on the number of people in your household, and you got them on a monthly basis. My daughter, who sort of picked up all my historic things, has some of the leftover stamp books in our cedar chest, which I used to store all those kinds of things in. And when we downsized, Stephanie got them all. She's got those hidden away there. But we always got more sugar stamps than we needed, so that my mother would trade sugar stamps for gasoline stamps so that we could go to Pismo from Bakersfield to the beach. So that was the war experiences I had. At that point, my father, who was never a farmer, he grew up in a farm home and was expected to become one, and that's why he only went to the 8th grade, because he had to come home and work on the farm as a kid. when he should have been in school because he was pretty smart and clever. He only got an 8th grade education. But then he was determined to leave the farm, and he went to a radio school in Los Angeles to learn how radios work, and he was hired as a radio service man in an appliance store in Bakersfield. That job kept him out of being drafted because at one point, and I remember this too, my father was told by his employer, get out of town, just leave, get out right now. So my dad went to Los Angeles, got a hotel room and stayed there, and the employer was able to convince the draft board that my father was needed in order to repair radios in the Bakersfield area. So his profession saved him from being drafted. I don't know what the circumstances were in terms of Mennonite non-resistance and nonviolence at that point, pacifism, because I had 2 younger uncles, my father's 2 younger brothers. One of them went into the service as a 1AO, which was non-combatant. He was sort of a clerical, but he wore a uniform and went into the army. Whereas my youngest uncle, John, maybe some of you know, I don't know if anyone in Reedley would remember him. He was on the state basketball championship team that Reedley won one year, completely demolishing all these preferred teams from the larger cities and towns. Reedley had a championship high school basketball team, and my Uncle John was on that team. He went active duty. So he was a tank repairman that was part of the Anzio invasion of Italy. He was in North Africa fighting Rommel. So my older uncle, the oldest in the family, he escaped because he was too old to be drafted at that point. But my father escaped by his profession. My 2 younger uncles, they went into the service, and that was sort of the story. You could, even as a Mennonite brethren in those days, choose how you wanted to behave. Nowadays, I don't know about you, but my impression is that most Mennonite brethren churches really aren't very worried about the peace position anymore, which to me is a loss rather than a gain, because I'm very pacifistic myself, and so I've been out in demonstrations waving the flag of peace rather than the flag of war. So in our church then, we've got all these, listen to this. I am descended either directly or as an uncle, a nephew, to the founders, 4 of them, of the Mennonite Brethren Church in 1860. And so are some others here. These are a list of people who are either directly descended or have uncles of some degree that were involved in the Mennonite Brethren founding. Me, Dennis Becker, Kevin Ence Rempel. Now I'm trying to remember what these initials stand for. Was I scribbled off initials? CBF. Courtney Becker Foster, Marlis Becker, Courtney Marlis, Hildy Dyke. She doesn't even know it, I don't think, because she's been very proud of her general conference history. Non-MB. These are all people that are descended from the founders, and Eunice Isaac. Yes, Carol Becker Friesen, that's right. In fact, she's descended from several of the founders directly on both her mother. Well, it's really a neat kind of descent. So we've got people that are descended from the founders of the Mennonite Brethren denomination in this congregation. I have down here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now Marlis and Hildy's connection is as a niece with a certain number of greats in front of it, of the first elder, the first religious leader of the MBs in Russia, Heinrich Hubert. So that might make it okay for Hildy. Now, okay, great. Now, in terms of Kleingemeinde, that was a congregation that was founded even before the MBs as a schism from the regular churchly Mennonites in Russia. We've got Gary Nachtigall, Marlis Becker, Bill Braun as direct descendants of the Klaus Reimer who founded that particular schism of the church. You go to the Krimmer Mennonite Brethren, which is now merged with the Brethren in 1960. We've got Delbert Wientz and his litter, D. Robb, and LJ, whoever LJ would be. Lynn Jost, their KMB background. So then it's amazing that we bring together the entire history of the Mennonite denominations that we know of, and yet we here are a diversity, equity, inclusive. We're exactly what the woke people are supposed to be or considered to be. So I guess we would have to admit that we're pretty woke in this congregation. And we have historic reasons for being that way. Now, my own grandparents, like I said on my father's side, came from Kazakhstan. My mother's were they are the ones I'm descended from the founders of the MBs, but my grandfather on my mother's side is of a wholly different bunch, and that is from Mennonite settlements around Warsaw, far away from where the other Mennonites were, in little villages like Deutsch Wymyśle, Deutsch Kazun. Those of you that have traveled with me through Poland, you have always stopped at those places because I always went back sort of as a pilgrimage. So I really was a child of the Second World War, a child of ethnic Mennonite background, Bakersfield, San Jose. We moved to San Jose, by the way, that my father got what was considered a very rare disease in Bakersfield that he was told was called undulant fever. And the doctors told him, this is in 1948, that if he stayed in the valley, that he would die in 6 months. So he moved to San Jose and lived to be 95, dying just in 2006. So he was this insurance man, a jack of all trades, ended up being a carpenter for a while, insurance salesman, encyclopedia salesman door to door for a while. And he ended up becoming a licensed real estate agent and a licensed building contractor. So he built custom-built homes and had a good life. Now, when I think of my life, it's a hodgepodge. I had 5 different streets that I was running down at various points. The street of family, the street of church, the street of career and education, the street of genealogy, and the street of music. And so I could tell you stories in all of these areas endlessly almost. As family, well, let's go to education first, because that sort of governed where I started all of the others. I was committed from the time when my uncle, my mother's brother, gave me for Christmas one year when I was probably about 8 years old, maybe even younger. He gave me a chemistry set, which after they left disappeared. My mother hid it. She did not want me playing around with little vials of potassium this and sodium that, and it went into the closet, and I don't remember seeing it until I was in high school. But I still, and that uncle, strangely enough, he was ethnic Mennonite, but he was anything but religious. He gave Christmas presents to me that changed my life, because that chemistry set we'll talk about, The other one, he gave me a collector's edition, a boxed volume of the Swiss Family Robinson.
Wow.
And so I started reading very early. I knew how to read, I think, before I went to school, because I remember my grandparents gave me a Rand McNally Atlas of the World, the 1940 edition. They issued it at every census. And so I knew, before I went to school, I knew all the countries of the world, all the capitals of every country that existed then, and the capitals of all the 48 states that we had. I still remember the 48 star flag, which many of you probably do. I think it lasted until 48, was it, that Alaska and Hawaii were added? 1960. Yeah. So many of you have that in your memories. But I still remember that old 48 star flag and the 49 star that lasted for just a few months. And it was 7 by 7, and that flew a very short period of time until the 51, when Hawaii became the 50th state. So let's go education. I went to wonderful high schools, was accepted at Stanford but couldn't afford to go there. So I went to San Jose State instead with a chemistry major in mind. I was going to be a research chemist, and I was going to win the Nobel Prize for chemistry. That the church knew that, because when I changed my mind, and we'll talk about that a little bit, Warren Carver's mother, Mrs. Abe Carver, heard that I was dropping chemistry and was choosing, of all things, to go into the ministry. She came at church and said, "I'm disappointed in you because you're leaving chemistry and you were going to win the Nobel Prize." I'm glad she had that confidence. But I worked my way through San Jose State at the county library. It was in an old brick building that used to be the city hall, the old city hall of San Jose. I still have a brick from it because it was dismantled. The brick is in the cedar chest too. And worked my way from the time that I was 12, when I got my first job, which was as delivering the San Jose shopping guide. I was self-supporting. My parents provided room and board, but I, from 12 on, bought my own school clothes, had all my spending money, and because I had fairly good jobs for kids in those days, I got a job as a deliverer of the San Jose Mercury News, which came out every morning. They used to have a morning paper and an evening, and my delivery was the morning. So I had to be up at 4 every morning for about 3 years, and loved it. I would go to the corner where there was by that time, a fast food place, a hamburger joint. Not a McDonald's yet. They hadn't come out yet. It was before McDonald's. But it was a place where the papers were delivered in a big bundle, and I would unbundle them and wrap them up and tie them up and put them in the bags on the side of and ride my bicycle. I had 120 customers, and I got from each of those, because the paper was $2 a month, I got 50 cents of that $2. So 50 cents, 120 customers was $60 a month I got as a 14-year-old. Now, my father wanted it. My mother told me this later, and it was the first really serious fight that they had, because my father had grown up on the farm, turning over everything to his parents. He even became an orderly at the Kern County Hospital after he left home, and sent his paycheck home to his father, and they gave him a $5 a month allowance. Well, here I was getting $60 a month, and he wanted me, my mother told me, to turn that over, and they would give me an allowance like he had received, but that it would go into the family bread and butter of the time. My mother refused to let him do that. She insisted that I learn how to handle money myself. and that I have the privilege of keeping what I earned on my own. But I had to use it for school clothes, for all of my entertainment, my own, when I got old enough for it to have a transistor radio that I carried around with me, that came out of my own money. So I got no money from my parents, even when I went to San Jose State. But of course, in those days, for California residents, the state college system was available at no tuition. It was free college training. And so I benefited from that. I paid $49 a semester because we needed to buy a student body card and have health insurance covered by the college. And that totaled $49 each semester. And I worked for the San Jose Public Library at $13.9 an hour. And that was my life. I caught my first classes, Chemistry 1A, was always at 7 o'clock in the morning. So I was up by 5:30, caught a 6 o'clock bus from Campbell, where I lived, to the San Jose Peerless Bus Depot, Greyhound Bus Depot, and walked from there to the campus, which was not far. And that was my life. I would get to school by 7 o'clock. 7 to 10 was a 3-hour lab, and would work at the library until 9 o'clock at night, and often would close the library, be the last person to turn the key, and then run to the bus depot for the 9:30 bus home. So I got home at 10 o'clock usually, and had to get up, like I say, at 5:30 to catch the 6 o'clock bus into town. I didn't see my parents very often except on weekends, and really had a very independent, free life, my whole life. I remember at that house where we were when we were in the running pattern for the Army Air Force Base with all the B-24s and B-17s even would land there. I, after the war, saw a B-36 land at Minterfield in Shafter. It's the only B-36 I've seen, and they were huge. The largest planes, I think they are bigger than many of the current ones, but we had evidence of war all around us. My grandparents in Reedley were officially designated as air spotters. Their job was to look at every airplane that they saw to see if it was. They had a book. All the Japanese and German warcraft was in that airplane book because everyone was worried about the war. And in fact, after the war, we still have a few here. One is close. It's on Barstow, just west of Blackstone. You'll see a funny little thing standing up that's painted yellow, a long pole with a round thing at the top. Do you know what it was? Air raid sirens. We grew up in an atmosphere where war was expected momentarily from the Russians. I remember in my 6th grade class, we had air raid drills regularly. Fire drills were one thing, but air raid drills were another. And my job was to close the Venetian blinds on this window in the classroom. And everyone had a job, and we would all end up under our desks waiting for the flash, with our eyes closed, of course, because we didn't want to be blinded by the flash of the atomic bomb going off in San Jose, or obviously from here in Fresno. Russia was expected to invade and to bomb. And I remember there was a journal of the atomic scientists. I forget the exact name of it. But on every cover, monthly cover of that magazine, they had a clock up in the corner. And they said how many minutes it was expected to be until 12 o'clock, the day of doom, arrived. And it got down to 2 minutes to 12. And the war was, and then to be someone who was descended from people that came from Russia. That was sort of a difficult spot to be in, even though our ancestors had escaped Russia to escape that same regime that we were worried about here. My father in First World War He was born in 1910. So he went to school and was chased home in Dallas, Oregon, from school every day during the First World War because he spoke German. And in fact, his grandfather, Dietrich A. Peters, the son of that elder that went to Kazakhstan, he was the lay pastor of the Dallas MB Church. And they would have, on occasion, soldiers come to attend the church service to make sure that no German was spoken in the church. And my great-grandfather spoke no English, and he was the lay pastor. So whenever the soldiers walked in, my great-grandfather would get up, my father says, he remembered it, in church, and as soon as they came in, he would say the sermon, which was his 2 words that he knew, "Time flies," and the congregation would respond, "Time flies," and get up and leave. That was the church services during World War I in a German-speaking church. When I was born, of course, it was before Pearl Harbor, so that I did research when I was at seminary here. I've got to hurry. And discovered that the Bakersfield MB Church records, the minutes of business meetings and all, was written in German up until the January 1941. 42, right, 42. And that month, the records shifted from being written in German to being written in English. So I grew up, because Bakersfield, that was the only German-speaking church in town. Same thing in San Jose, if it were still German-speaking. That was the only Mennonite church in town, so that they became anglicized much earlier than churches, for example, in the Midwest or in Canada. So there was no German spoken in Bakersfield at that time. In fact, it was very anti-racial. There were also no black persons in Bakersfield by law at that time. So I never, ever saw a black person until I was probably in high school, which is hard to believe, but that's why I completely understand. A lot of people that say that we should not be talking about how the blacks were treated, even in my lifetime, because that discourages them from, they know their history better than the whites in the classroom, and it's the whites and others in the classroom that need to hear the stories of enslavement. And so I'm another woke person that really disagrees with the ideas that are propounded that we should not have a critical race theory, that we should commend people for the good that they represent rather than point out the difficulties in history that they've been through. The communists, incidentally, did that in Russia. They erased the Mennonite history in the parts of Russia where the Mennonites had enormous estates. They were the industrialists of Ukraine. They had car factories, farm equipment families. They were the rich, of course, that got really mistreated later on after and during the revolution. But Russia erased them from the history books. And so when I started going back to Ukraine with Mennonite tours that I was part of, the people that lived there had no concept that they ever had wealthy landowners that were replaced by the state farms. And so their history was removed, just as some people think the sad history of many people should not be emphasized. And I'm just glad that we were able to re-educate, which we have done in Ukraine, the stories of what happened to us. And to some degree, I think that may be part of why Ukraine, although they have had a history of being subservient to the Russians, even though their history is far longer and far more beautiful, that's why they're resisting right now so heavily, returning to the so-called Russian fold. So, San Jose State, suddenly I attend the 1959 November Pacific District Conference, and H.H. Dick does the keynotes. I was sitting behind in the church choir, sitting, listening to him, and his topic for his keynote sermon was the uneasy conscience of the Mennonite Brethren Church. It was later published as an article in the Christian Leader. And it talked about how the church was abandoning its mission of compassion, service, and it caught me. And so I decided, well, I want to become a minister in the church. And this was in November of '59, and I immediately told my parents, while driving home from church, I was still living at home at the time, and they were shocked. And I immediately got on the phone and submitted. I told Tabor I wanted to come the next semester, which started in January. This is November, doing college admission in a 3-month period. And I had to wait for San Jose State's semester to end. The 2 semesters overlapped. San Jose State ended after Tabor started. So they were, for some reason I have never been able to understand, willing to, on the spur of the moment, accept this student from San Jose State that wanted to come to Tabor College as a second semester junior, and we had already discovered that I couldn't have a chemistry major at Tabor. I could not graduate with a chemistry degree because all of the courses that Tabor offered in the department of their chemistry, I had already taken. And they required 6 units in residence in order to graduate from the college. And they didn't have any 6 units to offer me. So I had to change majors. And so I changed to history as a major, which meant that I spent 3 semesters with many, many units each semester in history and in the required Bible courses, because, of course, San Jose State didn't have any Bible requirements, whereas Tabor did, that had, for most students, been spread out over the 4 years. I had to throw them into 3 semesters. So I had my work cut out for me. I remember having an 8 o'clock class every morning in history from L.J. Franz, Tom Hebert's grandfather. L.J. Franz was my history mentor at Tabor College. When I graduated, that was his last year as president. But he was president of the college in addition to being history professor, and every 8 o'clock in the morning, I would come stumbling into class, generally after the bell had rung, and he would, in his special way, say, well, we're glad to welcome the late Mr. Peters to class today. They really accepted me, and I have to sometimes listen to what Jeannie says about how the students felt about this student coming in the middle of winter to Tabor College and moving right in and running through the park, which then existed in front of the main building, on the way to school, throwing snowballs. I mean, I had never lived in a place where there was snow before. And I guess there was a lot of gossip going on about this strange person from California that was descending upon them. But they accepted me wonderfully. I remember arriving at Newton on the train to come to Tabor, and Dean Becker, some of you may remember him. He died quite a while ago. He was a cousin to Carol Friesen. He picked me up at the train station at 2 a.m. That's when the San Francisco chief that I caught in Richmond to get to there. My grandparents came to Bakersfield's platform to give me cookies and milk and all in the 3 minutes that we were there. And I arrived there. He drove me to Tabor, took me to my room where my roommate at that time was already asleep in the lower bunk, and so I took the upper bunk. And of course, the student that I suddenly became, I suspect at that point, an unwanted roommate with, was Al Workentine. He's now with us in Terraces, and so, those kinds of connections stay with you for a lifetime. And some of you may not recognize the kind of connection to other Mennonites that us ethnics have, but we grew up, we're often related, and we know it, and we've had experiences together. That's why there's this horrible, horrible thing called the Mennonite game, which is when you run into someone that has a recognizable surname that you know means that they're Mennonite by ancestry, because there are those names, then you immediately sit down and try to figure out how you're related. That's the Mennonite game, is figuring out your relationship. In fact, in that regard, now that DNA has suddenly come on the field, friends, it's almost time. I've hardly hit genealogy and music. We'll have to let those wait for a while. I've given you a hint of the genealogy, but I want you to know that it has blossomed. My collection, which I started out with no computers, so I ran through 2 typewriters, typed 3x5 index cards that had a family. Each card was a person. I ended up with probably close to 200,000 3x5 cards that I had typed, each one being a person with a Mennonite surname that I was able to detect. I even wrote the Russian, as a young student, wrote the Russian embassy because I was hitting dead ends on so many people that were born in Russia. And so I wrote the embassy saying, how can I get vital statistic information on my ancestors who lived in Russia? Boy, did I get a letter back from the Russian embassy. It was a thick pad, and it had a 12-page questionnaire in it, that here I was, a middle school student gets this letter saying you must fill out this questionnaire for each date that you, and here I was already in the thousands of dates that I wanted from Russia. And they said, for each date you need to complete this. And one of the things that immediately caught my attention was the whole several pages that asked what my connections to Russia were and if I had relatives that were still living there. And that was the clincher. I didn't keep I wish I would have kept that letter. I never kept the letter, never sent anything. Later on, when we were into Ukraine and there was freedom in Ukraine, Paul Taves and I, we went from archive to archive, like Harvey Dick did, another ethnic, and searched for the ability to get records out of what's now Ukraine. And we were successful, particularly with the Odessa archive. They were willing to freely grant us access to all the Mennonite materials which were there, which were considerable. The Peter Brown collection was a big part of the Odessa State Archives. The Dnipropetrovsk, or Dnipro as it's called nowadays, they have archives that was not welcoming to us because they saw it as an opportunity for them to make money. They said, we will do the research in the records if you pay for us to do that. We did for a while, but Dnipro was never as open to us as Odessa was. To make everything short, I ended up living through all of this, learning to be, because of my genealogical information about people, being a member of the staff of the Mennonite Heritage Cruise, which took 2,000 people back to their roots in Ukraine. I traced all of those 2,000 people's family trees so that we could take them to the villages where their ancestors left. So, and then later on, the same thing happened in the Poland trips. Peter Clausen had established a wonderful history of going to Poland and learning where the Mennonites had been there. And when he retired from that position, he asked if I would take over those tours, which I retired from in 2018, and now are being conducted by, Richard Thiessen is one of the leaders, and Kevin, the archivist at Bethel. Yeah. They are continuing that trip each summer. In fact, it was funny, I still have connections with Richard because of the organization that has developed that is the grandma organization that now runs just about everything that's genealogical among the Mennonites, including there was an earlier Mennonite DNA project, which is now under our wing. The grandma program has established an online capability, which is governed by the board now of what I initially donated as that initial 200,000 3x5 card information. It's now an international board of directors, and it's incorporated, called Mennonite Genealogy Incorporated. So I didn't give you any time, like Steve Cleary yesterday said, boy, wait till we ask you questions. Thank you for letting me talk through the period where you could have asked questions.
So, thank you so much, Alan, for sharing with us. We'll have to put you back on the schedule next year. And some of the others of you might want to also tell your story. Maybe it relates to this, or maybe not. But anyone who wants to tell their story, please contact me. We're scheduled through February next year. Thank you so much for sharing, Alan. We really want to hear your music story too sometime. So, yeah, and your wrestling story. Thank you, Alan.